Listening to Luke Stewart was the perfect prelude for our discussion today. It brought to mind my own sojourn from Atlanta to DC in 1975. And it brought to mind the realization within a very short time that the district was not the staid, stuffy, conservative, backward place that so many people had told me it was going to be. That it was actually a place rich and vibrant and delightful, pulling from its southern roots, pulling from its international community, people from all over the world settling here, and also people like Sam Gilliam, who came here from Louisville, before that Mississippi, and worked in the DC public schools, and then realized that there were other things to do, other things to think about, other things to create. And looking at and thinking about Luke Stewart's amazing performance, it brings to mind Sam's innovations, reimaginings, retoolings. That cover of Art in America in 1970, it was unheard of for a Washington artist, an African-American artist, to appear on that cover and to include on that cover these pieces of canvas that were draped and stained and splattered. I mean, you really have to think about this revolutionary thing that's happening in Washington, D.C., thanks to figures such as Sam. So what I'd like to do is invite my fellow conversationalists, Jonathan Binstock, Lisa Farrington, Valerie Cassel Oliver, and Kelly Jones to the stage. And we're going to continue this conversation about Sam and also about art and how art surprises us, how it touches us, how it reverberates with us in the most remarkable and amazing ways. So I want to start alphabetically. I'm sure you got that all through
Fantastic.
your life and education, but Jonathan's going to start us off.
Thank you, Rick. I will begin by saying thank you to Melissa and Rick for this invitation. I am delighted. I am proud, humbled to be here amongst such a distinguished group of scholars and friends and curators. It's a really wonderful place to be. And I also want to say Luke's prelude to this conversation was indeed ideal, was indeed perfect. I caught the organic, intuitive give and take with the medium and the process and forces that are not entirely under the musician's control, that he was able to taunt and toy with and manipulate in a way that would serve so beautifully his aesthetic ambitions. There was a sense of discovery in real time for me happening there. I'm sure Luke has practiced a lot to get to that ability, but nonetheless, I think the performance inevitably is going to be different for that piece, and very, very much in tune with kind of how Sam made his art over so many decades. I first learned about Sam's art in a course on the introduction to art by African Americans taught by Professor and Dr. Sharon F. Patton at the University of Michigan in 1992-93. And she became my dissertation advisor, and she was showing slides, and there was Sam Gilliam's draped paintings, and I was completely mystified. I thought they were amazing. I thought they were incredible. I had no real understanding of what they were, what they could be. Of course, I was looking at these works of art in slide form, but I was fascinated by the fact that she was laying it all out, right? She was placing the work into a history. She provided the context, Sharon Patton. She was, in essence, kind of just spoon-feeding her students the information, which she had and not a lot of people had at that time, the history of art by African Americans. But despite all of her wonderful contextualizing and explanation, I still wasn't able to grasp what was going on with those works. And I'm the kind of guy who maybe likes a difficult time or a challenge. So I said, okay, I'll dig deeper into that. And that's how I got to Sam. I met Sam for the first time, I want to say in 1994, when I moved to Washington, D.C., and I would visit him with some regularity to learn about his art. I discovered in the course of a conversation and conversations with him that I would research his work and write a dissertation on his work. And at the time he was making paintings, amazing paintings. Really, the work that Sam made from 1992, 94 until the very last moments was, in my personal opinion, as good as anything he had made throughout his career. Right? We talk about the early work. It's great. It came first, redefined, pioneered, all of this. But he continued to innovate. He continued to think in the ways that he thought in 1966 or 67. He continued to press throughout his career. And at the time, in 94, he was pouring acrylic onto wood panels, birch plywood constructed panels, cutting them up, reassembling them, framing them in aluminum frames at times, turning things around, upside down, throwing things away, pulling things out of a pile of discarded items, reinterpreting, reusing, constantly experimenting, right? Experimenting. And you see that upstairs. You see that in the paintings upstairs. You see in some paintings there are these encaustic pellets or aluminum pellets, or the painting has been passed over with a heat gun to melt those encaustic pellets. But in the other one, the pellets are left whole. Some of the paintings are cut into quarters. Some are not. The quarters are arranged as a kind of a target or a plus sign, and you can think about the inversion of a rectangular form kind of turned inside out in a way. Then it's arranged as an X. You think, oh, X, who does that bring to mind? Or what does that bring to mind? A negation of some kind, a painted frame, an unpainted frame. There's a painting in the studio which I love. I have no idea how he made it. It looks like it was painted with sort of an icing extruder that you would use to write somebody's name on a cake. But I asked folks in the studio, no, you're wrong. That's not how he did it. I'm like, all right, And then, of course, they try to explain it to me, and I don't understand because I know nothing really about paint. All I know is that it looks like something I've never seen before. And this is so essential to who we are trying to kind of wrap our heads around and our eyes around. Very, very slippery, right? Just always, I think, you try to grasp hold of what he has accomplished, and that effort, you work hard, but the goal eludes you, right? There's just no. So I'm going to, and so this is really good because now I get to listen to all of you explain to me what I still feel like I don't quite understand.
Thank you, Jonathan. Valerie.
I don't know if I can elucidate, but I will say what an honor it is to be here, and thank you, Rick, for the invitation to come and celebrate Sam. And I feel what Rick did was to create an invocation. We're at the Church of Sam, and so I just want to, proselytize a little bit. I met Sam as a graduate student at Howard when I lived here in Washington, D.C., and he really was a bit of a North Star for a lot of the studio students. And every now and again, I would tag along with them to his studio, which was always open to them. And he was a generous spirit. And I think oftentimes that gets a bit hidden in a way because we think of the icon, the painter, when in actuality he was a teacher always at heart. And the innovation that happened in the studio was really forefront in his mind, how to always contribute, but then also to bring people along. There were always young people in the studio with him. And so I'm looking out of the audience, I see Dan, and I know there was E, and there were many people over the course of his long and vast career that were in the studio with him. But Sam was truly someone who wanted to honor process, and he did so with understanding painting, understanding color, which he always said continued to elude him. How? I don't know, because he was masterful, absolutely masterful. But he always understood his place as within the canon. I think he was very clear coming from Kentucky, coming from Mississippi, that he was bringing his roots with him. And those things were very much affixed in the work itself, and the cutting and the collaging and the quilting, if you will, because that in essence is what it was. It was bringing those things along. The beveled edges was a notation to carpenters and people who worked with their hands, and understanding that there is a labor that's brought to bear. Even in the studio, it is labor as well. And he's bringing that aesthetic that oftentimes gets relegated to the margins. He's bringing it in and folding it into a more formalized, recognizable understanding of painting, but he's bringing it all along and innovating along the way. And you see it. You see it in 1977 with Rail, but you see it in 2021. And he said his studio was always open. And I was so blessed, Annie, that I was always welcome into the studio. Of course, he would always say, bring your passport, which was my son. I couldn't come without my son, which he was so delighted to always have that energy in the studio. But up until the time, he was saying, I am doing my best work. I am doing my best work. He never stopped moving. And you see it. You see all the processes there. You see the raking. You see the heat gun. You see the accumulated surfaces. You see things embedded into the surface of the paintings. And the X for X, Malcolm X, for Annie. So oftentimes people look at abstraction and they feel there's no narrative. Sam was very clear there is narrative embedded here. It may elude you, but it doesn't elude me. April 4th, certainly the stained canvases in honor to the assassination, but often the life of Martin Luther King. So he was very much aware of the world around him. I think that was due certainly to Dorothy and her role as a journalist. He was keenly aware, too, about the world around him. He never left that behind, even in the studio. So it carried forward with him in the work. And I just feel incredibly blessed to have had my time with him, my personal time with him. And he was very much one of those father figures in the field, and very generous of spirit. But my son, when he passed away, and he saw that beautiful article on Sam, he said, Mom, Mr. Sam was famous. Because to him, he was just Mr. Sam. And I think that speaks volumes to the life of a man, not just the production and the career and the life's work of an icon, but the spirit of a man. And so I'm definitely a disciple, and I'm just thankful to be here and to share that.
Amen, Valerie. Lisa.
Rick.
We know each other. We go way back.
So I will start by thanking you, Rick, for inviting me and for being able to join longtime colleagues. It's a new colleague, but we'll be longtime soon. And congratulations on the Dirty South. I'm sorry, I had to say that. One of the best shows I've ever seen. So I came to DC also to go to Howard very shortly after you and after Sam. And at Howard is where I discovered Sam Gilliam. Coming from New York, even though I went to art school in New York for several years, there was, in those days, no African American art history outside of HBCUs. So coming to Howard, oh, by the way, all my Howard colleagues, hello. So I came to Howard. I took my first ever African-American art course with Tritobia Benjamin, who was my mentor for life. And I could only hope to grow up and be her. That was my goal. And she showed us images of Sam Gilliam's work even then. This was before 75, so it's relatively early. But there was a slide sharing program that went on amongst African American art historians and artists so that they could teach Black art, even though there was really no good solid resource in terms of images and so forth. So I learned a lot about two artists who work with fabric, Sam Gilliam and Faith Ringgold, who, of course, I've written a couple of books about her. And so Sam's work stuck in my head from university. I went on to American University to do my master's, which is one of the seats of the Washington Color School. And Sam talks a lot. Oh, I should say that. My mind is just dashing. I'm working on a book now for a coffee table book on the writings and thoughts of Black artists in the 20th century. And it's really difficult because I have to pick and choose who to include and who not to include because I can't write a 1,000-page book. I've had that problem in a couple of books. By the way, there are about 40 artists, African-American artists in my Oxford survey on African-American art who are not in the book. But I wrote about you, just so you know. And when the press made me reduce the length of the book to the contracted length, I made them put all of the essays online under the Oxford University Press banner. And so that everybody, including, but Sam is in the book, of course. He didn't get excised. So the book I'm working on now, I had to choose a selection of Sam's writing for his section. And one sentence from my manuscript, which isn't out yet, jumped out at me, and I'll read it to you because it connects with this show. He said, this was in 1973, "I'm interested very much in impasto, even to the point where it escapes and crackles, when it really determines its total materiality and goes beyond the limit of what we would call control." And that makes me, of course, think of the performance we just heard, because It is a marriage. What Sam understood was that the artist, in a way, is the vehicle. The paint is not the vehicle. The materiality of the paint, of the canvas, it's speaking on this universal level to the viewer, and it speaks through the hand of the artist. I was in an artist studio yesterday, abstractionist. Lisa, are you here? And we were talking about the value and the meaning and the depth of abstract art. And what Sam is showing us through all of his work is not how to think without a narrative that comes from this world. How to get past this physical, ordinary world that, not ordinary, but you know what I mean, knowable world that we live in, and go past that. And there's a German expressionist, Kandinsky, who wrote the On the Spiritual in Art in 1912. Okay. And he said something profound in this little treatise. He said, just quiet your mind, I'm horribly paraphrasing, and just feel. And when I was up today looking at the paintings, that's what they did for me. I could feel more than just, or more than just see colors and texture. I could feel the artist's heart, soul, I would say hand, but in this same treatise, in this same interview in 73, Sam Gilliam said, if I could kill the hand, that's the goal. In other words, make the art like you would make a child. A lot of artists have been referred to that way, the creators, like mothers create children. And then you let it go. You let it go out into the world, which is the world of us, the viewers, and you let the viewers experience some of this universal connection that we all have, that we all experience through abstract art. And if we think about what's most important to us in life, love, emotion, even things like hatred, what causes wars, all of the things that are truly tangible, much more tangible than this table, yes? Those things can't be drawn or painted, right? How do you express the real weight of what it means to be human when it's not our bodies or the sky or the sun? Only abstract art can express the inexpressible, the things that we can't see. And so what I want to thank Sam Gilliam for, if I could say it that way, is to thank him for a couple of things. But one, giving us this ability to lose ourselves in his work. I taught for 15 or more years at Parsons School of Design in New York after Howard. And none of the students, almost none of them were African American, mostly from Asia. And we went on a field trip to Philadelphia, not to see Sam Gilliam, to see, I don't know, Cezanne something. But on the exterior of the building, huge, 30 by 30 feet, was one of Sam's draped canvases. I don't think the students saw anything that I showed them inside the museum that day. The whole trip back, all they could talk about was the draped canvas. And I realized that because it didn't have a story, it touched them much more deeply than if it had. So, is my 10 minutes up?
We're going to talk. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Sam, wherever you are.
Kelly.
I'm so glad to be here, so glad that this is happening today to celebrate this amazing career and life of a person. I want to just follow up on what Valerie said also about the students. Because one person who I had studied quite a bit or written about, Houston Conwell, sought Sam out when he was at Howard because of the abstract voice, because he wanted more of that. And I didn't really realize there were so many, that this was just an ongoing thing for many other reasons. Sam, I think one of the things that I always talk about is community. And what Sam Gilliam meant to me is the kind of how you can see the community of artists around him. The Louisville artists, Bob Thompson, Sam Gilliam, Houston Conwell also. Also, the idea of, in staining, when we're talking about that, and I also want to thank Jonathan for his lovely book of 2005, which really still, you should get it, because it still elucidates so many important aspects about Sam's work. But this idea of staining, not only with somebody like Morris Louis, but also people like Bearden, Al Loving, how much of what he did was part of the larger community of artists, but of course he did it in his own way. The idea of the drapes, suspension, which you can see in people like, again, Overstreet, Tuttle, but also somebody like Hess, Robert Morris, Joe Overstreet famously with the ropes and all these things. And this idea of shape, even in somebody like a Tom Lloyd and Al Loving, which are more hard edge or even sculptural. But then we can think of how Sam would do it with cloth, but even in the paintings that kind of follow the drapes when he starts getting into the shape canvas. The use of canvas as fabric, when Valerie talks again about this idea of roots, so many artists, particularly from my point of view, African-American artists who were really interested in that idea of canvas as fabric. Al Loving, Overstreet, again, Howardina Pindell, the idea of the sewing that you see so much, that collage that follows the drapes. You can see that in Pindell. I think that hasn't been talked about enough, maybe by Val. And then his return to this drape, always as a motif. He still keeps innovating, innovating with the texture also. I think in these last paintings, these tondos, you can see how he's joining all these things towards the end. It's also amazing. This man is working into the last minute. I mean, when you see paintings in 2022, you just catch your breath, right? Oh my God, amazing paintings. But to join all these things that he had been interested in, the bevel, the texture, the kind of shine of these elements too. I think what also, when we also think about roots and this idea of community, the other thing is how he and these other artists of this, African-American artists of this generation, again, Al Loving, Jack Whitten, others who Mary Schmidt Campbell said famously had an aesthetic collegiality, right? Negotiated Black nationalist 60s and 70s by still affirming that relating to a Black community was important to them, but also affirming they would not back down from their own experimentations. And I want to read a quote from, I don't know if it's from the same 73, but it's also 73 that I have used. Figurative art doesn't represent Blackness any more than a non-narrative, media-oriented kind of painting like what I do. You know, so I think that really defines a whole generation of people.
especially African American artists. But at the same time, he said, no, I think that was in 84, actually. In 73, he says, even just the phrase, Black art is the best thing that has happened for the condition of Black artists in America. It really calls attention to the number of major galleries in New York and museums around the world that had not shown, were not showing, were not willing to show any work by any Black artists. Yet everyone has not come aboard, you know that. And there's that same kind of tokenism as before. But there is nothing to suggest in the history of men that we will ever arrive at utopia. So I'm so glad you are publishing some of these amazing words that he has and others have written. I think finally what the work also brings in terms of this community, in terms of still wanting to, whatever you're making, relate back to a root, to a home community in some way, is the idea that Barbara Chase Rabeau, who you can also put in this same camp of abstraction and use of fabric as well, talks about as maximalism. And she says, we have too much minimalism in this world. Let's get maximal. And what it really brings to mind is what these artists were trying, particularly African American artists, were trying to get into these works as well, was this idea of something beyond just style and process, but some kind of feeling that they could bed in there. And I'm not going to say it was Black art in that way, but this idea of the maximal, that the art wasn't just those things, that it had perhaps a spiritual element, another kind of element. When we go again back to the Tondo is used as a kind of commemorative spiritual portrait. Other people who used it like that, somebody like Betty Blayton. So I think they all, in this abstract moment, also relied on that.
Thank you so much. I'd like for us to talk amongst ourselves for a few minutes. What came to mind in particular, Lisa, when you were talking, was a painting that's at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, April 4. I think it's April 4, 1969. And I've always been intrigued with that work. Clearly, it's acknowledging the horrors of that previous year with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Washington in flames, in riots. But Sam chose to address that in a very particular way. He gives us this title, which is kind of a clue, but then we are confronted with these splatters and with a particular palette and an expanse. And it's almost as if he's saying, we want to acknowledge the horror and the realities of America at the end of the 1960s. But there's a way to address that. There's a way to articulate that. There's a way to make sense of that, or maybe not to make sense of it, but a way to feel it, through this action, through what's going to happen on that canvas between Sam Gilliam, and that surface. I mean, any thoughts about that? Indefinable kind of action.
I think it's beautiful the way you put it, because we understand narrative, we understand writing. If someone, and as many have done, wrote about how they felt about the 68, but you read and then you're dealing with the symbols, you're translating them in your head. What you're missing is the direct connection to the experience that so many Americans and even people around the world had. How do you connect on a gut level to each other without the words? And that, I think, is what that painting in particular, and Sam's work in general can do. I had another thought. Of course, when you get old, you don't lose your memory. You just every year you're stuffing so much more information in there that stuff has to leak out, to make room. So, So what I want to say about that is, okay, for example, Raymond Saunders wrote that amazing treatise, Black is a Color. And when you read it, it's very personal to him. And you have to agree or disagree. But art is more subliminal. And abstract art, really so. So Sam's paintings don't dictate to you. They leap over the conscious mind that has the ability to resist the information. And it goes right into your heart and your soul. And here we are, decades after 69, and you're still feeling that. I mean, who could remember an essay from 69? Do you see my point about the painting? Yeah. Anyway, that's my thought.
Sure. Jonathan, did you have some thoughts about that?
I'm struck by the range here of contributions, the sense of community. And Sam has been about community from day one, working with kids in his neighborhood around his studio, bringing them into the studio, welcoming, loving young people, of course. I have a similar experience with my daughter being with Sam in the studio. This idea that he's tapping into a material, a medium, a format, painting, which is something that so many people in the world share. We all get that, it's paint on a surface. It can be canvas, something else. So it's very fundamental. It's time-tested, and it's a kind of a lexicon that we all have access to. But then you approach Sam's painting and you feel like, wait, it's paint on a canvas, or it's paint on wood, but this is not an experience I've had before, which ties into a little bit what, Rick, you're talking about in terms of April 4, the education piece, working with students in high schools in Washington, D.C., at Carnegie Mellon, at Howard, at any number of places where he would have been a visitor, a faculty member, et cetera. There's a lot to work through, and it all comes together in a kind of sense of poetry, the way poetry brings together things that are not words, that are not necessarily obviously connected, right? The pane of a window pane, whatever. Like you juxtapose words in poetry and you get a new meaning. And it's not just that he juxtaposed new materials, whether it's aluminum beads, which I had never seen in his work. I had never seen, maybe he's used them, but, or new processes. When I was in his studio in April, he was pouring paint, letting it run in rivulets down the surface of these large canvases and layering the paint, adding new, and it looked kind of like I didn't quite get it. Of course, I never quite get it. I go to the studio, I'm just like, I'll see what happens. And he said, yeah, you will see what happens. And I'm gonna see what happens too. And then he says, okay, team, bring out the fans, bring out the dehumidifiers, he turns his studio into a kind of wind tunnel. And I'm chatting with him for about an hour, and I walk back into the studio, and they are transformed. The back layers are being pulled to the front. He knew, all right, poetry, like what does community have to do with universal lexicon of paint on canvas, have to do with a love of young people and teaching, have to do with, he's a vast figure. And I'm really grateful to be listening to our colleagues here. And Rick, your amazing lectures at the National Gallery, where you shed new light in all sorts of ways, not only on Sam, but a much bigger topic, color in general, and the history of African American art. He's blushing.
As you were talking, Jonathan, I was thinking about something I never understood in college, and that's physics. But Sam, in some ways, kind of educates us in the sciences as well, and about gravity and energy. And as you all were talking, I was thinking about, the different Sam Gilliams. There's the splash moment. Actually, before that, as you know, there are these solid geometries. But then upstairs we see these layers and the sophistication of those layers. And as we approach this work, we realize that yes, there's no narrative to speak of, but we as human beings on this planet engage with those textures, with those, what's underneath a color and then what's underneath that color. In some ways, it's fascinating that we have Sam Gilliam on one floor and then we have Mark Bradford on another floor, and we see that whole history of layers and textures, providing in a strange way their own kind of meta histories. That as human beings we learn how to see through textures, see through torn and stained and layered elements in our world to make sense of what happened before, and then what happened before that, and what happened before that. And Sam was just kind of our educator, in that regard. Yeah.
It's funny because the language you just used, torn, layered, time moving, all of which his paintings conjure up, are also descriptors of existence, of of the suffering, the layering of being human. And this is what the paintings are. They are his soul in physical form.
Jonathan, did he ever talk to you about those great photographs of him, in the studio? I guess they were taken in the 80s. Tony Barboza did a couple of them where he's got the overalls on, and there's paint on his body, there's paint on his boots. I mean, it's kind of, he's surrounded in these kind of colors and textures and layers. Yeah.
I'm just going to say Dark as I Am.
Yes, of course.
What do you want to say about Dark as I Am?
Well, you curated it into your show. So
yeah, but I know what I said.
About it.
Well, yeah, this is, he literally takes his clothing and the tools from his studio, he hangs them in the corner of the Jefferson Place Gallery, I think in 71 or 2 or 3. And there's a paint tray and a roller, and it's all covered with paint, and it fills the corner. It's an installation. That was the result of the same installation existing in his studio for a few years, where he played with it and manipulated and added and subtracted and so forth. And then finally, he takes that installation and condenses it, concentrates it onto the surface of a panel or a canvas, I can't remember, covers it all with black paint, the layers, building that history of who he is, literally. It's one of the great self-portraits of the 1970s, without question, because it's more or less abstract. He's got a dowel that's affixed to the surface of the panel, the canvas, which is something that he would have wrapped his drape paintings around for storage. The shower curtain hanger or whatever, the closet, all the metaphors and stories, the many, many stories he's told about how he invented or created, discovered the draped painting. Like, I've never heard the same story twice. And it's all there, but it's not there. And you have to experience it, and you have to appreciate the work and the years that went into building the stratification, the complexity. I mean, we're so grateful he lived so long, because the best artists, I believe, tend to live a very long time. And in Sam's case, that was essential to creating the full picture, the full circle. Coming back here to the Hirshhorn, of course, is a lovely thing with these circular paintings. But boy, there's so many layers to work through, right?
No, I was just thinking the same thing, the presence and the absence coexisting simultaneously, and Sam was masterful at that, and just getting back to the April 4th, there was a series of paintings. It wasn't just one. It was a series of them. And I love the fact that he made them large. And it was very much in the same manifesto as the abstract expressionists. You make it large. You evoke the sort of larger than life sensibility to it, but putting history in your face. He was very much provocative in that way. I mean, very subtle, but very provocative. Those paintings are visceral. And they almost evoke the staining, the blood stains, the splattering, the blood stains. And so, again, there is this sort of absence and presence of narrative, and that one can say so much with such with such simplicity. You didn't have to do a whole lot. You didn't have to. He knew when to restrain and when to really work the surface and accumulate upon the surface. But then those early works, and he does go back and forth to them, are completely restrained. I was very fortunate to install Jonathan's exhibition when it toured Houston and came to the CAM. And I had known Sam as a young person, being in and out of the studio, but that was the first time I really was, the whole work was around me, and I saw the huge sort of arc that he went between the sort of restraint and then explosion, and restraint and explosion, and then had the great fortune to also have him in several shows. Black in the Abstract I did in 2 parts, and he was in both sections. He anchored both sections because it was just the arc of the work. And he never stopped innovating. Absolutely. And really, a real mixture between, as you say, leaning into spirituality, leaning into evoking the visceral, the aesthetic. That's what aesthetic is. It's moving someone through the visual, but then also evoking sound. And that was one of the things I forgot to mention in my earlier conversation, that masterful exhibition in Basel, The Sound I Saw, that he was very cognizant of somehow capturing the intangible within the static. And you feel it in the work. You feel it.
Kelly, you were going to say something.
2 things. Now, you brought up sound, but you were mentioning, Valerie, the series of paintings. I had the great privilege to show Red April in, which is,
Great.
you can get the relationship to April 4th in my show Witness Art and Civil Rights in the 60s, and it going back to the idea of community, how it lights up around works that are also abstract but also figurative in this mode about how artists were witnessing that time and civil rights struggles. So it just popped and really related to so many things. And so it does kind of move in and out. And it's also what you said, Lisa, about students being able to put themselves in the narrative, people being able to see their own narrative and to relate to that abstract voice. And the other thing I wanted to mention was music. When, of course, Walter Hopps is the first to show the drapes at the Corcoran, as you point out. Walter Hopps was also someone who, before he became a curator, was a jazz presenter. And for him to think about he and Sam could share Coltrane, but then Coltrane was also shared by so many others, that sheets of sound that all the artists of that generation were fixated on. Jack Whitten, how music could evoke an abstract language for them. And as musicologists would say, you know, that kind of free jazz moment, hard bop moment could also evoke some kind of African sound, a sound that was not on the classical European scale. So I think there's so many layers in terms of what music did for people like Sam and that generation.
As you all were talking, I was thinking about Rashid Johnson's kind of rediscovery. And I put that in quotes because for some of us, we've always known about and loved Sam, but there is this kind of new generation that has seemed to have kind of realized what was before them all along, that there was this incredible artist who was doing this very, very important work. And so on one hand, it's wonderful that he's been kind of re-embraced by a contemporary scene. But the fact of the matter is he's been with us for the longest and has been giving us these insights for a while. I was doing some research a couple of weeks ago, and I found an interesting photograph. I think it's in the archive at the Columbus Museum in Georgia on Alma Thomas. And it's a photograph that Alma Thomas took of James Herring, who was kind of the elder of and the creator of the art department at Howard University. And this was a photograph taken in 1962 with Sam Gilliam. And they were both standing there, and Sam had like a sailor's kind of shirt on. It was striped, horizontal stripes, and James Herring had a hat on and a shirt and tie and a vest. I was fascinated by this generational coming together, these two pioneers, because James Herring really was one of those people who pushed Washington, D.C. to be more forward thinking, to think about artists like Elizabeth Catlett in the 40s when, very few people, or William H. Johnson. And then seeing him next to Sam Gilliam, it was almost as if he knew that he was kind of passing that baton on to someone who, even in the early 60s, he sensed was going to take the scene someplace else. And I guess I'm back to Washington again as this kind of fascinating place where these people are, where they're working, and where they are kind of colliding with certain kinds of traditions. And talk about colliding, I'm also thinking about being here. Lisa's my witness in the department at Howard University, which was kind of Black Arts Movement Zone 1, with Jeff Donaldson and
Ground Zero.
And a whole bunch of artists connected to Afro-Cobra. And yet there was already this scene happening in DC with people like Sam Gilliam. So this is a really fascinating place where all of these kind of energies around the African-American art seem to have thrived and blossomed.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen the Lou Stovall workshop exhibition at the Phillips, you ought to. You see it, you feel it. You've got Lloyd McNeil, who was both a musician and a painter, right? You've got Jeff Donaldson, you've got Sam Gilliam. I mean, they're poles apart.
And Alma Thomas.
And Alma Thomas.
In the midst of all of this, kind of really reimagining. And abstraction is this amazing, I wouldn't even call it a style. It's an attitude. It says that words and narratives just aren't enough. That there's something else that has to be done that is more open-ended, that allows audiences to engage on their own level, as they will. And they use the tools of color. It uses the tools of shape and angles and texture to kind of evoke its story. And Sam was clearly a master of that.
I just want to make 2 points. One, I want to underscore Valerie's comment about restraint and the opposite, right? And kudos to Luke for really demonstrating in his interpretation, his way, what that feels like and sounds like in an incredibly effective way. I mean, that movement back and forth, that kind of breathing in, breathing out, it's sort of fundamental. Nobody's just one thing, right? Especially Sam. And you saw that. I mean, you'll remember from 2005, the last paintings in that show were these monochromes that were gelatinous and poured and kind of organic and goopy and biological. They weren't just crisp geometric things. So the other thing now I'm going to forget, but it's leaking out over there. It's leaking out. Yeah, it's leaking out.
But you were mentioning geometry, and again, I'm back to Washington, because Washington is, a geometry 101, the way it's designed by L'Enfant. And this is a city that operates on these shapes, these triangles, these squares, these diamond shapes, these circles. I remember when I first got here, I said, this is a crazy place. I've got all these circles, and then you've got the crisp. It's like Paris in that way. But Sam again picks up on that geometric paradigm, and even to the final moment, we see these works that utilize this circle in such a sophisticated way. Again, with these insertions, and this is fundamental. This kind of goes beyond anything that's very specific. This is universal. This is why we're here on this planet.
But I also love, even at the time when he was doing those minimalist paintings, he would allow the rawness of the canvas to exist alongside of those painted strips. That he was very much cognizant of the absence, the presence again, and the absence, that duality. So I think it's, and then the staining and the folding, and then the chance that happens within the studio, always being present. I think that was part of the Washington Color School, to play with the rawness, where paint existed and could inhabit space, and where there was void as well. But then Sam took it to the next level, as he would always do, being another generation coming from a different geography altogether, and taking it up and making it completely his own. He superseded in so ways. But about back to community in Washington, even when the Alma Thomas exhibition was up at the Phillips, you saw Sam's work. So there was something about the camaraderie, the engagement, the whether it was theater and poetry and music. There was a very strong community here that consisted of layers of generations of individuals who would press each other to push it further along.
I remember now. We're talking about abstraction at a time when a lot of people didn't care. Not that it wasn't being made, but if you looked at the art magazines, and if you went to the gallery shows and you were up to speed on what was really being talked about, it was other things. It was land art, it was minimalism, it was pop art, it was feminist art, it was conceptual art, video art. And this was always he just did it his own way. We have to, we've been talking about how he did it his own way. But it's not like by choosing abstraction, he was like choosing a kind of mainstream path. Because abstraction, he sort of picked it up precisely when it was falling out of fashion.
No, it's very true. What I loved, and a big shout out to Afrocobra too, because what I felt they did when they came to DC was to take that sense of color, but also the figure, and dissolve it into color and geometry. So they were too playing on this push and pull. They were leaning into figuration, which was dictated by the sort of Black arts movement, but then also pressing it to the next level. And so in that respect, Sam was always welcome. There was still a love of abstraction. They were still getting to that sense of syncopation, and where the figure was just there, you could see it. But color and form and geometry were really foregrounded. So I don't think he ever fell out of favor, but I think you're right. The market certainly moved on from abstraction. And maybe that's where we get to this notion of rediscovery. I never, that narrative about Sam being discovered was so disturbing to me personally, because I knew, and I knew everyone else who knew Sam, and that Sam was constantly working and constantly being shown. But to the point of HBCUs and the strength of HBCUs in keeping those narratives alive, those narratives were not readily available on mainstream universities. They were not there. There were no one in those universities teaching Black art. So it's understandable that a new generation would come to Sam with an unknowingness, if you will.
But then there's also Studio Museum. I hate that narrative too of rediscovery when, so many African American artists in, the news now, and it's great to see it, but unknown. Oh, this work wasn't shown. Yes, it was. It was shown at places like Howard, like Studio Museum in Harlem.
Like MoMA, like Whitney, like the Venice Biennale.
That's true. It wasn't just that.
But, in terms of, I think of all these shows that Mary Schmidt Campbell did in the 80s of Sam and Al Loving and Howard Dina, and keeping that abstraction, that voice alive, and just showing all these artists over time still. So, this undiscovered narrative is just always bugs me.
It's a trope.
True.
But you're right about the teaching of it. But I think there's so many places that have been showing this work for many, many years and just have been, decided people weren't going to look there, because it wasn't a mainstream gallery.
And you're absolutely, and shout out to Studio Museum in Harlem, and forgive me. I mean, talk about that. Yes, absolutely. There have been venues that, as Kelly is absolutely right, that there was a deaf ear turned to those spaces because they didn't serve the commercial viability.
And that early show, was it called From Red to Black?
Red and Black to D.
To D. Yeah, that was an amazing exhibit at Studio Museum of Sam's.
You have to ask, unknown to whom?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And I love what Courtney Martin says about Sam. She's the director of the Yale Center for British Art, and she does not remember not knowing who Sam Gilliam was, which I just love. As a kid, Sam was on the wall. His name was discussed. The books were there, and that's real. Her whole life.
I was also going to add that he's also someone who has been accessible to collectors, burgeoning collectors, new collectors. Of all places, I remember visiting Charlotte and Noelle. She has a wonderful gallery. She had a gallery for many years in Charlotte, and she was selling these incredible little Sam Gilliams. They were, the kind of size that you could put in an apartment. And I thought about that he connects with a collector, and a gallerist, and he realizes that there are certainly venues for these big monumental works, but there's also an opportunity to create on a scale, not just size-wise, but price-wise, that somebody who's just beginning can afford. And so he was always there. And then prints. He was doing incredible prints, lithographs, and he did that series for College Art Association. So this was an artist who one assumes that abstraction is this distant form, but he was really engaged and very involved and committed to making sure that work could be experienced and enjoyed by a very large audience.
That is so important, his generosity. And you see it in the way he made art. An incredible printmaker. So many prints, of course, so many paintings. You know, I was at the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester. I asked Sam, would you please consider giving the Memorial Art Gallery one of those new draped paintings? They're so great. So he said, sure. And then you get the package and there's 2 in there. You know, that kind of thing. And that makes me think of the children, his approach to kids, and that sort of openness and loving the openness of kids. And I mean, openness. I mean, it's just...
As you're talking, I'm thinking about the project that I did at the turn of the century to conserve a legacy, American art from historically Black colleges and universities. And as we were going to Fisk and Atlanta University and Howard and other institutions, it was just interesting what we found and also what we didn't find. What we didn't find were, surprisingly, a lot of the works connected to the Black arts movement. We could not find some of those definitive artists like James Phillips and Jeff Donaldson. What we did find, however, were Alma Thomas's and Sam Gilliam's and William T. Williams. So this gives us another kind of narrative about, you know, those abstract artists and their engagements, as we've been talking about, with a wider community. Clark Atlanta now has one of those early drape pieces that they got, you know, just at the moment that he's doing all of those works. And we were so lucky to be able to have access to one of those pieces as telling this larger story of American art at historically Black colleges and universities.
I wanted to connect back, and this will be my final remark. I wanted to connect back to what you said about music, both of you, because while I was sneakily going on my phone, I referenced Kandinsky's On the Spiritual in Art, and he's considered, arguably, to have made the first truly non-objective painting. He says, color is the keyboard, the eyes are the hammers, as in the piano. The soul is the piano with its many chords. The artist is the hand that, by touching this or that key, sets the soul vibrating. That's Sam Gilliam to me.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah. This has been great, but we also have incredible art to see at the Hirshhorn. Please go upstairs and see Full Circle by, of Sam Gilliam's amazing work, curated by Evelyn Hankins. And again, let's give great applause to Kelly Jones, Valerie Cassel Oliver, Lisa Farrington, and Jonathan Binstock. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rick.
And Rick Powell.